They say the truth will set you free, but they never tell you about the cage it leaves behind. It was a Tuesday, a gray, rain-slicked Tuesday in Portland, when the walls of my life didn't just crack, they vaporized. I've spent 24 years building a fortress of normalcy. I was Joseph Barrett, the reliable husband, the doting father, the man who handled everyone's finances but apparently couldn't account for the deficit in his own soul. I thought I knew exactly where I stood in the world. I thought I knew the scent of my wife's perfume, the sound of my daughter's laugh, and the depth of their love. I was a fool. I was a man standing on a frozen lake, admiring the view, completely unaware that the ice had already turned to slush beneath my feet. The morning started like any other, filled with the mundane rituals of a family that functioned like a well-oiled machine. I remember the smell of the coffee Sumatra, bold and bitter, and the way the light caught the steam rising from Betty's mug. She was moving through the kitchen with that effortless grace she always had, a woman who looked 10 years younger than her age, wearing a silk robe that I'd bought her for our anniversary. Our daughter, Audrey, was 23 and back home for a few months while she found herself between marketing gigs. She was sitting at the breakfast bar, her face buried in her phone, scrolling through some influencer's feed with a focused intensity. "Dad, you're going to be late for the Tech Vista pitch," Audrey said without looking up. She had my eyes bright green and sharp, but today there was a flatness to them I should have noticed. I know, I muttered, checking my watch. This meeting was the big one. 3 years of networking, 6 months of late-night audits, and a proposal that would essentially double the size of my firm. Everything is ready. I just need to grab my briefcase and my sanity. Betty stepped over, smoothing the lapel of my suit jacket. Her touch was warm, familiar. "You're going to crush it, Joseph. You're the best there is." She kissed my cheek, and for a split second, I felt like the luckiest man on earth. Then, the phone rang. It wasn't a normal ring. It was that sharp, intrusive chirp of a landline that usually only meant one thing: trouble. Betty answered it on the second ring. I watched her face, waiting for the usual, "Hello," but instead, I watched the blood drain from her skin. Her hand went to her throat, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the receiver. "Mom? What? When?" Betty's voice was a frantic whisper. "How high is the fever? Is Dad breathing okay?" I felt my own pulse quicken. Betty's parents, Walter and Mildred, were in their 80s and lived about 2 hours south in Salem. They were the kind of people who were too proud to ask for help until the house was literally on fire. Okay, Mildred, breathe. We're coming. We'll be there as fast as we can," Betty said, hanging up. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with tears. "Joseph, it's Dad. He's got a fever of 103, and Mom says she's having chest pains. She thinks it's a heart attack, but she won't call 911 because she doesn't want the neighbors to see the ambulance." The panic in the room was instant and thick. Audrey was already on her feet, grabbing her car keys from the bowl by the door. "I'll drive, Mom. We can be there in 90 minutes if we take the back roads." "I'm coming with you," I said, reaching for my own keys. "No." Betty's voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it. She caught herself, softening her tone immediately. "No, Joseph. The Tech Vista meeting. You've worked for this for years. If you miss this, the firm loses everything. Audrey and I can handle this. We'll call you the second we get to the hospital. Betty, your parents are like my own parents." "I don't care about the meeting," I protested. "Dad, listen to Mom," Audrey said, her voice firm, rational. "Grandpa would be furious if he knew you blew the biggest deal of your career for a fever. We'll keep you updated every 15 minutes. Just go. Win the contract for him." I hesitated. My gut was screaming at me to go to Salem, but the logic, the cold, calculating logic of a financial advisor told me they were right. I couldn't do anything for a heart attack that a doctor couldn't do better. I hugged them both, feeling the frantic beat of Betty's heart against my chest. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last time I'd ever hold her and feel anything other than pure, unadulterated disgust. They left in a rush, the tires of Betty's silver sedan splashing through the puddles in the driveway. I stood in the doorway, watching their taillights disappear into the mist. I felt a profound sense of unease, a cold prickle at the base of my neck that refused to go away. I tried to focus on the Tech Vista proposal. I looked at the numbers, the spreadsheets, the projections. But the words blurred. Around 10:30 a.m., I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the Tech Vista headquarters, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I had 20 minutes until the meeting of a lifetime. My phone was silent. No updates. No, we're halfway there. No, Mildred is okay. I called Betty. It went straight to voicemail. I called Audrey. Same thing. A thought entered my mind, one of those dark, intrusive thoughts that you try to push away because it feels like a betrayal of trust. What if they aren't in Salem? I shook it off. That was crazy. Why would they lie about a heart attack? But the unease grew into a full-blown physical ache. I looked at the glass doors of the office building where my future was waiting. Then, I looked at the GPS. Salem was 90 minutes away. I put the car in reverse. The drive was a blur of rain and adrenaline. I told myself I was being a hero. The devoted husband, who couldn't stay away in a crisis. I imagined the look of relief on Betty's face when I walked into the hospital waiting room. I even stopped at a florist in Woodburn to buy Mildred's favorite white lilies, thinking she'd need something bright to look at in a hospital room. I was playing the role of the perfect man in a movie that was actually a horror film. When I pulled onto Sycamore Street in Salem, I expected to see chaos. I expected an ambulance, or at least a neighbor's car out front. Instead, the street was deathly quiet. Walter and Mildred's modest cream-colored house sat perfectly still under the dripping oak trees. The first thing I noticed was the gate. Walter was a fanatic about that gate. He'd lived there 40 years and never once left it unlatched. It was wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. The second thing I noticed was Betty's sedan. It wasn't in the driveway. It was tucked behind Walter's old pickup truck, partially hidden by the overgrown hedge at the side of the house. I parked 3 houses down, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know why I was being so quiet, why I felt the need to sneak up on my own in-laws' house. But the instinct was primal. I walked up the driveway, the white lilies clutched in my hand like a ridiculous peace offering. As I got closer, I heard it. Music. Not the frantic sounds of a medical emergency, not the hushed tones of a worried family. It was the upbeat, synthesized theme song of a daytime game show coming from the living room. I reached the front door and found it slightly ajar. I pushed it open an inch, my breath hitching in my throat. The smell hit me first, not the scent of sickness or antiseptic, but the rich, buttery aroma of Mildred's famous shortbread cookies. I stepped into the hallway, my shoes silent on the carpet. I could see into the living room. Walter was sitting in his recliner, a newspaper across his lap, looking as healthy as a horse. Mildred was on the sofa, laughing at the TV, a plate of cookies on the coffee table. There was no fever. There were no chest pains. There was no hospital. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean against the wall. They had lied. My wife and my daughter had fabricated a life and death emergency to get me out of the house and away from my office. But why? I heard voices coming from the kitchen, low, intense, and familiar. "We have to move the rest of it today," I heard Audrey say. Her voice was different, cold, clinical, devoid of the bubbly warmth she'd shown me that morning. "The tech meeting will keep him occupied until at least 3. That gives us a 4-hour window." "I know, honey," Betty replied. "I'm just nervous. If Joseph ever looks at the offshore statements." "He won't," Audrey snapped. "Dad's a genius with other people's money, but he's a total idiot when it comes to his own. He trusts you, Mom. That's his biggest weakness. We've already cleared out the Vanguard account. Once we transfer the equity from the house, we're gone." I felt the world tilt. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I hit the voice memo app and held it toward the kitchen door. I needed proof. I needed to hear the rest of the execution order for my life. "And what about Evan?" Betty asked. There was a pause, a silence that felt heavier than the rain outside. "Evan's waiting at the office," Audrey said. "He's got the forged power of attorney ready. By the time Dad realizes the house has been remortgaged and the accounts are dry, we'll be halfway to the Caymans. He'll be left with the debt and a very empty house." "I almost feel bad for him," Betty whispered, but there was a smirk in her voice I could hear through the wall. "He really thought we were the perfect family. He thought he was the hero. Audrey said, and then she laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that tore through the last shred of my heart. But every hero needs a tragic ending, right? I stood in that hallway, surrounded by the photos of our perfect life, our wedding, Audrey's graduation, the trip to Maui, and I realized I was a ghost in my own home. I wasn't a husband or a father. I was a target. I was an ATM with a pulse. I backed away, my heart feeling like it was made of lead. I needed to get out before they saw me. I needed a plan. But as I turned to slip out the front door, I saw something that stopped me dead. Parked at the curb, just visible through the side light of the door, was a black SUV I didn't recognize. A man was sitting in the driver's seat, watching the house. He looked young, fit, and entirely too patient. That must be Evan, I thought, the man who was helping them bury me. I realized then that this wasn't just a theft. This was a coordinated strike. They weren't just taking my money. They were taking my identity, my future, and my safety. And if they were willing to fake a heart attack to get me out of the way, what else were they willing to do? I slipped out the door, the white lilies falling into the mud. I didn't go back to my car. I went to the side of the house, crouching behind the bushes, my phone still recording. I watched as the front door opened. Betty and Audrey walked out, followed by the man from the SUV. They weren't crying. They weren't worried. They were smiling. The man, Evan, put his arm around my daughter and kissed her. Then, he turned and gave my wife a familiar, intimate pat on the waist. My stomach did a slow, agonizing roll. It wasn't just my daughter's accomplice. The three of them stood there in the rain, looking like the happiest family in the world, while I huddled in the dirt, realizing that the man I'd been for 56 years died in that hallway. A new man was taking his place, a man who had nothing left to lose. They climbed into their cars and started the engines. I watched them pull away, heading back toward Portland to finish the job. I waited until the sound of their engines faded into the gray noise of the rain. Then, I stood up, wiped the mud from my suit, and looked at the house. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't know how I was going to fight back against the two people I loved most and the stranger who had replaced me. But as I walked back to my car, I knew one thing for certain. The tragic ending Audrey promised. It wasn't going to be mine. I sat in my car for a long time after they left, the rain drumming a frantic, irregular beat on the roof that matched the pulsing in my temples. My hands were still locked on the steering wheel, my knuckles white and bloodless. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a man I didn't recognize. My face looked hollow, the skin stretched tight over bone, my eyes wide and haunted. I looked like a ghost, which was fitting, because the life I had known only an hour ago was officially dead. The drive back to Portland felt like navigating a dream or a nightmare where the physics of the world had suddenly shifted. I kept replaying that laugh, Audrey's laugh. It was a sound I had cherished for 23 years, a sound that, to me, represented every sacrifice I'd ever made. Every late night at the office, every weekend spent auditing spreadsheets instead of going to the coast, every missed golf game, it was all for her, to keep that laugh bright, to ensure she never had to know the kind of struggle I'd grown up with. I didn't know it yet, but that laugh would become the soundtrack to my undoing. How does a man like me, a man who literally makes a living spotting red flags in other people's portfolios, miss a forest fire in his own living room? I asked myself that question 1,000 times as I crossed the bridge into the city. I thought back to the early years. Betty and I met at a small library in Beaverton. She was quiet, wearing a soft blue cardigan, and she had a way of looking at me that made me feel like the most important man in the room. We were the golden couple. We built a life on a foundation of always and forever. When Audrey was born, I felt like the circle was complete. I was the provider. I was the protector. I was the fool who never looked behind the curtain. I pulled into our driveway on Oak Ridge Drive, the house looking as pristine and welcoming as ever. The flower beds were neatly mulched. The porch light was already on, casting a warm, deceptive glow. It looked like a home where love lived. But as I stepped inside, the air felt thin, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the rooms. I walked straight to my home office and locked the door. My heart was still racing, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. I opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keys, a cold sweat breaking out on my upper lip. I logged into our joint accounts, the ones Betty said I never checked. She wasn't entirely wrong. I trusted her implicitly. I managed million-dollar portfolios for Tech Vista and other giants. I didn't think I needed to audit my wife's grocery spending. But as the transaction history loaded, my world began to tilt on its axis. The first $3,000 transfer had happened 18 months ago. It was labeled simply as consulting. Then another, 2 weeks later. Then they became weekly, like clockwork. $3,000, $3,000, $3,000. It was a slow, systematic bleed. It wasn't a heist, it was a harvest. They had been reaping my hard work for a year and a half, right under my nose, while I kissed them goodnight and told them I was lucky to have them. I dug deeper, my vision blurring with rage. I found the Vanguard account Audrey had mentioned. It was empty. 6 figures, my entire personal rainy day fund, wiped clean 4 months ago. The destination was an account I didn't recognize, routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. My breath hitched. I'm a financial advisor. I know how these things work. You don't set up offshore shell companies for a little extra spending. You do it when you're planning a permanent exit. I leaned back, staring at the screen. Why? That was the word that kept screaming in my head. Why would they do this? We had everything. We went to Maui every Christmas. Audrey had a college fund that would have covered a PhD. Betty had a wardrobe that cost more than some people's cars. But then I remembered what Betty whispered in that hallway in Salem. He's ignored our emotional needs for years. Was that it? Was I so focused on the provider part of the job that I'd forgotten the husband and father parts? I tried to be honest with myself. I worked a lot, sure. But I was there for every birthday. I was there when Audrey broke her arm in the 3rd grade. I was there every time they needed a check signed. Apparently, in their minds, the checks weren't enough. Or maybe, the checks were exactly what they wanted, and they just found a way to cut out the middleman, me. Then I remembered the man. Evan. I pulled up the surveillance footage from our Ring doorbell. I'm meticulous about security, a trait my family always teased me for. Dad's being paranoid again, Audrey would say with a roll of her eyes. I went back 3 months, scrolling through the clips of mailmen and delivery drivers. Then, I saw him. A black SUV pulled into the driveway on a Tuesday, a day I was always in Seattle for meetings. A man stepped out, tall, athletic, wearing high-end athletic gear. He didn't ring the bell. He had a key. He walked right in like he owned the place. An hour later, Betty came out to the porch with him. They didn't look like friends. They looked like a couple. She was laughing, her hand resting on his bicep, the same way she used to look at me before the emotional neglect supposedly set in. But wait. I scrolled forward. 2 weeks later, the SUV was back. This time, Audrey was the one who met him at the door. She didn't just greet him, she practically tackled him. They stood in the foyer, the door half open, and they kissed. It wasn't a quick peck. It was deep, hungry, and entirely too familiar. My stomach turned. My wife and my daughter were sharing the same man. The man who was helping them rob me blind. The man who was currently at the office, forging a power of attorney. I felt a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my gut, but it was being rapidly overtaken by something else, a calculated, icy focus. They thought I was an idiot. They thought my trust was a synonym for stupidity. They thought they could move the equity from the house today and disappear into the Caribbean sunset while I was busy pitching a tech firm. I checked the time. It was 1:45 p.m. If they were at the office, my office, doing what they said they were doing, I had a very narrow window of time to act. I stood up, but my legs felt like lead. I walked over to the built-in bookshelf and pulled back a false front I'd installed years ago. Behind it sat a small, fireproof safe. Inside were the original deeds to the house and my grandfather's old service revolver. I didn't touch the gun, not yet, but I grabbed the documents. I needed to see if they'd already filed the paperwork. As I was closing the safe, I heard the garage door groan open. My heart leapt into my throat. They were home. They weren't supposed to be home for hours. Why were they back so early? Had the Evan plan gone faster than expected? Or had they seen me in Salem, I heard their voices in the mudroom. They were laughing. Actually laughing. I can't believe how easy that was. I heard Audrey say. The notary didn't even blink. He just saw the signature and stamped it. Lug. Your father really did make it too easy, didn't he? Betty's voice was light, airy. He's so predictable. Always the same routine. Always the same blind spots. I stood frozen in my office, the door locked, the light off. I held my breath. The documents clutched to my chest. I could hear them walking toward the kitchen, the clink of wine glasses. They were celebrating. They were celebrating the fact that they'd just effectively erased me. I realized then that I couldn't just call the police. Not yet. If I called the cops now, they'd find a way to spin it. They'd say I was abusive, that they were just taking what was rightfully theirs, that the forgery was a misunderstanding. They had the charm. They had the victim narrative ready. No, I needed more. I needed to know exactly how deep this went. I sat back down at my desk, my movements silent and practiced. I pulled up the hidden drive on my computer, the one I used for highly sensitive client data. I began to write. Not a suicide note, though for a moment, the thought crossed my mind. No, I began to write a script. If they wanted a tragic ending for their hero, I was going to give them a plot twist they never saw coming. But as I was typing, a notification popped up on my screen. It was an email from my life insurance provider. Subject: confirmation of beneficiary change. My blood went cold. I hadn't changed my beneficiary. I clicked the email. The primary beneficiary on my $3 million policy was no longer Betty. It was a trust. A trust named the E. A legacy fund. E for Evan, A for Audrey. And then I saw the date. The change had been requested an hour ago, along with a secondary document, a notice of intent to claim in the event of accidental death. They weren't just waiting for me to lose the house. They were waiting for me to die. And based on the accidental death clause they'd just highlighted, I didn't think they were planning on waiting much longer. The sound of footsteps approached my office door. A soft knock followed. Joseph? Honey, are you in there? Betty's voice was sweet, dripping with that fake concern that had fooled me for 2 decades. I thought you were at your meeting. Why is the door locked? I looked at the gun in the safe. I looked at the accidental death notice on my screen. I realized that if I opened that door, my life wouldn't just be over financially. It might be over. Period. I took a deep breath, forced my voice into a calm, tired tone, and said, Just finishing a call, Betty. Give me 5 minutes. Take your time, dear, she said, her voice receding. Audrey made some of that tea you like, the one with the special honey. It's waiting for you in the kitchen. The tea. The special honey. I remembered then that Audrey had been taking a pharmacology elective last semester. I sat in the dark, staring at the closed door, knowing that the next 5 minutes would determine whether I lived to see the sunrise or became the accident that funded their new life. The door to my office felt like the only thing separating me from a hungry pack of wolves. I stood there, my hand hovering over the lock, listening to the silence on the other side. Betty had walked away, her footsteps light and rhythmic, but the air she left behind was heavy with a new kind of threat. I looked at the fireproof safe, then back at the laptop screen glowing with the confirmation of my own death warrant, the E.A. Legacy Fund. They weren't even being subtle anymore. They were so confident in my stupidity that they had branded their betrayal. I reached down and wiped the sweat from my palms onto my trousers. I had to go out there. If I stayed locked in this room, it would signal that the predator had finally realized he was the prey. I needed to be the Joseph they knew, the man who was predictable, the idiot who trusted his wife. I opened the safe one more time, tucked the forged documents deep into the pocket of my blazer, and hesitated. I didn't take the gun. Not yet. Carrying a weapon would change the geometry of my soul, and I wasn't ready to become a killer. I was an auditor. I would destroy them with the one thing they couldn't forge, the truth. I turned the lock. The click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, forcing my face into a mask of weary professional exhaustion. Joseph? There you are, Betty said, appearing at the end of the hall. She had changed out of her robe into a sundress, something light and floral. She looked like a woman ready for a garden party, not a funeral. "How did the meeting go? You look like you've been through the ringer." "It was long," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. I walked toward the kitchen, my skin crawling as I passed her. I could smell her lavender perfume, the scent that used to mean safety. Now, it smelled like the flowers you put on a grave to hide the scent of decay. The Tech Vista people are meticulous. They want every penny accounted for. "Well, that's what you're best at, isn't it?" Audrey said. She was sitting at the kitchen island, a steaming mug of tea pushed toward the empty stool next to her. She didn't look up from her phone, but I saw her eyes flick toward me for a microsecond. She was vibrating with a nervous energy I'd never noticed before. Was it guilt? Or was it the adrenaline of a hunter closing in on a kill? "Sit, Dad. You need to decompress," she said, her voice a pitch too high. "I made you that chamomile and manuka honey tea. It's got that herbal blend you liked last time." I sat down on the stool. The mug was beautiful hand-thrown pottery we'd bought in Vermont 3 years ago. The steam carried the sweet scent of honey, but beneath it, there was a faint, bitter metallic note. Or maybe I was just imagining it. My mind was racing, cataloging every pharmacology textbook I'd seen in Audrey's room over the last 6 months. She'd told me she was interested in holistic medicine. I realized now she was just looking for a way to make a murder look like a heart attack. I didn't know it yet, but my daughter had been practicing on the neighbor's dog just weeks prior, a stray that had suddenly dropped dead in our driveway. "Drink up, honey," Betty said, leaning against the counter, watching me. "You've had such a big day. You need to sleep." Yes, a long, permanent sleep, I thought. I picked up the mug. The porcelain was hot against my fingertips. My mind was screaming at me to throw it in their faces, to scream that I knew about Salem. I knew about Evan. I knew about the Caymans. But I played the game. I brought the mug to my lips, letting the steam dampen my face. I tilted it back, but I kept my teeth clenched, letting only a tiny drop touch my tongue. It was bitter, violently bitter. "It's a bit hot," I coughed, setting it back down. I reached for a napkin, deliberately knocking my elbow into the mug. It tipped over, the dark liquid spreading across the white quartz countertop like a spreading bruise. "Oh, damn it. I'm so sorry," I said, jumping up. I'm a klutz when I'm tired." The reaction from them was instantaneous. Audrey's face didn't just fall. It twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury for a split second before she caught herself. Betty gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. They weren't worried about the mess on the quartz. They were devastated that the dose had been wasted. "I'll make you another one," Audrey said, her voice tight, nearly snarling. She reached for the kettle. No, I said, waving my hand. "My stomach is actually a little sour. I think I just need some water and a nap. The Tech Vista deal. It's a lot of pressure." "You should go lie down," Betty said, her voice regaining its honeyed edge. She walked over and rubbed my shoulders. Her hands felt like ice through my shirt. "Audrey and I have to run a few errands anyway. We'll be back in an hour to check on you." "Errands?" I asked, looking her in the eye. "It's raining pretty hard out there." "Just some things for the house," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Rest, Joseph. You've earned it." I watched them leave. I stood at the window, hidden behind the curtain, and watched them get into the sedan. They didn't look like they were going to the grocery store. They were talking animatedly, Audrey gesturing wildly, her face red with frustration. They were probably calling Evan, telling him the accident had been delayed. As soon as their car cleared the end of the driveway, I didn't go to sleep. I went to Audrey's room. I'd always respected her privacy, a relic of my idiot trust. But that man was dead. I tore through her desk, her closet, her laundry basket. I found it tucked inside a hollowed-out book on marketing strategy, a burner phone. It was cheap, plastic, and vibrating. I opened the messages. My heart stopped. "Evan, is he out yet?" "Audrey, no." The idiot spilled the tea. "I think he's suspicious." "Evan, doesn't matter. The flight is at 1:00 p.m. If he's not dead by 8, we just take the bags and go. I've got the notary's signature on the house sale. The buyer is a shell corp I control. The cash is already in flight to the Caymans." Audrey, what about Mom? Evan, she thinks she's coming with us. Let her think that until we get to the airport. I'm not splitting this 3 ways, babe. It's you and me. Always. I sat on the edge of Audrey's bed, the burner phone trembling in my hand. It was a betrayal within a betrayal. My daughter wasn't just helping Evan rob me. She was helping him rob her own mother. And Evan? He was the apex predator in this ecosystem of vipers. He was going to discard Betty like a piece of used luggage the moment they hit the tarmac. What happened next was the first time I felt a spark of something other than grief. It was the cold, flickering light of a plan. I realized I couldn't just save my money. I had to save myself, and in a twisted, lingering way, I felt a flicker of pity for Betty. She was a thief and a traitor, but she was about to be destroyed by the very daughter she was protecting. I looked at the time, 4:15 p.m. I had less than 4 hours before the final move was supposed to happen. I needed to move faster than they did. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I called a man named Silas. Silas was a fixer I'd met years ago through a high-stakes client. He dealt in the kind of information that didn't exist on public ledgers. Silas, I said, my voice cracking. I need a full digital sweep and a freeze on a shell company. I have the account numbers, and I need to know exactly who Evan is. Everything. His real name, his past, his weaknesses. This sounds expensive, Joseph. Silas's gravelly voice came through the line. Take it from the Vanguard account, I said. Whatever is left. Just get me the leverage I need by 7. Consider it done. What are you going to do in the meantime? I'm going to prepare for a dinner party, I said. I hung up and walked back downstairs. I spent the next 2 hours in a fever dream of activity. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't call a lawyer. I went to the kitchen and began to clean up the spilled tea. I moved slowly, deliberately. I poured a glass of wine and sat at the dining room table, the table where we'd had 1,000 happy meals. I thought back to 3 years ago. The moment I now realized was the turning point. Audrey had come to me with a brilliant idea for a fashion tech startup in New York. She wanted $500,000 from her trust fund. I had looked at her business plan and seen the holes, the lack of market research, the overinflated projections, the sheer vanity of the project. I'd told her no. I'd told her she needed to learn the value of $1 before I'd let her spend 500,000 of them. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She'd just looked at me with those green eyes, my eyes, and said, "You'll regret being so stingy, Dad. You really will." I thought she was just being a dramatic 20-year-old. I didn't realize she was declaring war. I didn't realize that was the day she started looking for someone like Evan. Someone who would tell her she was a genius. Someone who would help her take what I wouldn't give. At 6:30 p.m., the front door opened. I heard them laughing again. That god-awful, chirping laughter. "Joseph, are you still awake?" Betty called out. I stood up from the table, my glass of wine in hand. I looked at the door, my heart cold as a stone. I had the burner phone in my pocket. I had the forged deeds on the table. And I had a piece of information from Silas that had just arrived via text, a piece of information that would change the entire trajectory of the night. Evan wasn't a trainer. He wasn't a consultant. He was a wanted man in 3 states for a sweetheart swindle that usually ended with a missing persons report. "I'm here, Betty," I said, stepping into the foyer. "I'm very much awake. In fact, I've never been more awake in my life." They stopped in their tracks. They looked at me. Then they looked at each other. They saw the wine. They saw the documents on the dining room table. And for the first time in 24 years, I saw something in my wife's eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. "What's all this, honey?" Betty asked, her voice trembling. "Oh, just some light reading," I said, holding up the forged power of attorney. "I thought we could go over the details before your flight at 10. And I think we should invite Evan over. After all, if he's going to be the new beneficiary of my life, I really should get to know the man who's going to be spending my money." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the rain hitting the window panes. Audrey's face went white. Betty's jaw dropped. How did you?" Audrey stammered. "The tea was a nice touch, Audrey," I said, taking a slow sip of my wine, the untainted bottle I'd opened myself. But you really should have spent more time on the special honey and less time on the burner phone in your desk. I pulled the plastic phone out of my pocket and set it on the foyer table. Evan is on his way, I said, a dark, jagged smile spreading across my face. I told him the money was ready to move, but I needed his personal signature. He's very motivated by cash, isn't he? He's actually quite the romantic. Did he tell you about the wife and 2 kids he has in Vancouver? Or was that a secret for the honeymoon? Audrey's eyes went wide. She looked at the burner phone, then at me, her mouth working but no sound coming out. Now, I said, gesturing toward the dining room, let's sit down. We have so much to discuss before the accident happens. The walk from the foyer to the dining room was the longest 10 yards of my life. My legs felt like they were made of reinforced concrete, each step heavy with the weight of 2 decades of lies. I could hear the 2 of them behind me, their breathing shallow and jagged. The house, this beautiful, expensive monument to my success, felt like it was shrinking, the crown molding, and the designer wallpaper pressing in like the walls of a trash compactor. I pulled out a chair for Betty at the head of the table. She sat down, her body stiff, her hands clutching her silk skirt as if she were trying to hold herself together physically. Audrey stood by the sideboard, her eyes darting toward the back door. She was calculating the distance. She was a runner, had been since middle school. I remember cheering for her at state championships, my throat raw from screaming her name. I thought I was raising a leader. I didn't realize I was training a fugitive. "Sit down, Audrey," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a frequency I didn't know I possessed. "The doors are locked. The security system is armed. And Silas, the man I'm working with, has his people watching the perimeter. You're not going anywhere until we finish our meal." It was a bluff. Silas didn't have people. He was a ghost behind a keyboard 3 time zones away. But they didn't know that. They only knew the Joseph who followed the rules, and that Joseph was dead. They were terrified of the stranger sitting in his chair. I spread the documents out across the mahogany surface, right next to the silver candle holders we'd received as a wedding gift from Betty's parents. The same parents who were currently sitting in Salem, blissfully unaware that their daughter and granddaughter had used their deaths as a smokescreen. I looked at the forged deed, the signature a nearly perfect replica of my own. It was a work of art, really. I didn't know it yet, but Audrey had spent months practicing that signature on the back of old bank statements she'd fished out of my office shredder. "Why, Betty?" I asked, looking directly at my wife. Her face was a ruin. The makeup she'd applied so carefully that morning had begun to smudge, making her look old and exhausted. 24 years. I thought we were the lucky ones. I thought we were the couple people looked at and said, "That's how you do it." Betty's lip trembled. She looked at the wine glass in my hand, then at the floor. "You were never there, Joseph. Not really. You were always with a client, or on a conference call, or flying to some conference in Chicago. I was the one who managed the house. I was the one who dealt with the leaky roof and the lonely nights. You just provided the checks. You didn't think I deserved a little something for myself? For the life I gave up for you?" "Something for yourself," I repeated, the irony like acid in my throat. "You've stolen over $200,000 in 18 months. You've cleared out my retirement. You've put a lien on the roof over our heads. That's not something for yourself, Betty. That's a scorched earth policy." It was Audrey's idea. She suddenly blurted out, her voice cracking. She pointed a trembling finger at our daughter. She said you'd never notice. She said the money was just sitting there, wasting away in accounts you didn't even look at. She said it was our inheritance. Just early. I turned my gaze to Audrey. She didn't look ashamed. She looked bored. She'd crossed her arms over her chest, leaning back against the sideboard with a defiance that made my blood boil. "Don't act like a martyr, Dad. You have millions. What's a few $100,000 to you? You wouldn't give me the money for the startup. You wanted to teach me a lesson. Well, consider this my final exam. I learned how to find the money you wouldn't give me." "And the insurance policy?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "The accidental death clause? Was that part of the lesson too? Did you plan on teaching me how to die so you and your boyfriend could go to the Caymans?" Audrey didn't flinch. "Evan said it was the only way to be sure. He said you'd hunt us down if we just ran. He said if you were gone, it would be cleaner. No loose ends. No loose ends, I whispered. My own daughter had discussed my murder over tea and honey like they were planning a weekend getaway. The room went silent, the only sound the persistent rain drumming against the glass. I found myself drifting back to a memory from 10 years ago. We were in the south of France, a villa in Antibes. The sun was setting over the Mediterranean, and I remember watching Betty and Audrey laugh as they waded into the turquoise water. I had felt a sense of peace so profound it almost hurt. I thought, this is it. I've done it. I've secured their happiness. I didn't realize that, even then. The rot was starting. I was the provider, the bank, the hero of a story they were already rewriting. What I didn't know then was that while I was looking at the sunset, Betty was looking at the real estate agent's business card in her bag, wondering how much the villa was worth in cash. I shook the memory away. The past was a luxury I could no longer afford. Let's talk about Evan, I said, leaning forward. The E in your little legacy fund. You think he loves you, Audrey? You think he's your partner in this? He does love me, she snapped. He's the only one who actually listens to me. He sees my potential. He doesn't treat me like a child who needs an allowance. He sees your bank account, Audrey, I said. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. Silas had sent over the final file. Evan isn't a trainer. His real name is Marcus Thorne. He's 42 years old, not 32. He's a professional romance scammer. He targets wealthy women and their daughters, playing them against each other until the accounts are dry. He has a wife, Megan, and 2 young boys in Vancouver. They think he's a traveling medical equipment salesman. I slid the phone across the table. On the screen was a photo Silas had pulled from a private Facebook group. Marcus, or Evan, blowing out candles on a birthday cake with 2 little boys and a woman who looked strikingly like a younger version of Betty. Audrey grabbed the phone, her eyes scanning the screen. I watched the defiance drain out of her. Her face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. No, this is a fake. You're lying. You made this up to turn me against him. Check the timestamp, Audrey, I said. That was taken 3 days ago. The day you thought he was scouting locations for your new office. He was at a Chuck E. Cheese in Vancouver. Betty reached for the phone, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She looked at the photo, then at Audrey. The 2 of them, the mother and daughter who had shared a man and a betrayal, were now sharing the realization that they were both just marks in a much larger game. He told me I was the only one, Betty whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. He said he was only using Audrey to get close to the files. He said once we had the house money, we'd leave her behind. Audrey's head whipped toward her mother. What? He told me the same thing about you. He said you were a necessary obstacle and that we'd ditch you at the airport. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They sat there, staring at each other. The web of lies they'd spun around me suddenly entangling them instead. They weren't partners. They were rivals for a ghost's affection, and they'd both been discarded before they even left the house. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. A sharp, demanding chime that echoed through the empty hallway. We all froze. I looked at the security monitor on my tablet. A black SUV was idling in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the rain. A man stepped out, adjusting his jacket, a confident smirk on his face. Evan, or Marcus, or whatever he wanted to be tonight. He's here, I said, my heart starting to pound with a cold, rhythmic fury. The man of the hour, the man who's going to help us finish this tragic ending. Don't let him in, Betty pleaded, her voice thick with terror. Joseph, please. He's dangerous. He told me he's done things. He's hurt people who got in his way. Oh, I'm definitely letting him in, I said, standing up. I walked over to the safe and finally reached for the service revolver. I checked the cylinder, 6 rounds of .38 caliber cold reality. I tucked it into the small of my back, hidden by my blazer. He thinks he's coming here to collect the final signature and a glass of champagne. I'd hate to disappoint a guest. I walked to the foyer, my footsteps echoing on the hard wood. I could hear Audrey and Betty whispering frantically in the dining room, but I didn't care what they had to say anymore. I reached the front door and looked through the glass. Evan was standing there, checking his watch, looking like the picture of success. He had no idea that the idiot had been replaced. I gripped the handle, my fingers steady. I didn't know it yet, but the next 10 minutes would be the most violent of my life, and not a single shot would be fired. I opened the door and forced a smile. "Evan, you're right on time. Come in. The girls and I were just talking about you." He stepped inside, shaking the rain off his coat. "Joseph, good to see you, man. Betty said you had a rough day at the office, but I figured you'd want to wrap up this paperwork before the weekend." "Absolutely," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. I felt the muscle there, hard, trained. He was a dangerous man, but arrogance is a far greater weakness than lack of muscle. "We're all in the dining room. Why don't you join us? We've already started the celebration." He walked ahead of me, his swagger filling the hallway. As he turned the corner into the dining room, he saw the documents. He saw Betty's ruined face. He saw Audrey clutching the burner phone. He stopped, his entire posture shifting from friend to predator in a heartbeat. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing the charming lilt. "Sit down, Marcus," I said, stepping into the room behind him. I didn't reach for the gun. I reached for the tablet on the table and hit send on an email I'd drafted earlier. "I just sent a very interesting package to your wife in Vancouver," I said. "The bank statements, the photos of you with my wife and daughter, and the GPS coordinates of this house. She's on her way, Marcus. And so is the Portland PD." Marcus turned to me, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You think you're smart, old man? You think a few photos are going to stop me? I've already moved the money. The equity transfer is irreversible." "Is it?" I asked. "Check your phone, Marcus." His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his thumb swiping the screen. As he read the notification, the color didn't just leave his face. He actually staggered back. "The account is frozen?" he hissed. "How?" I used a tier 4 encryption on that Cayman shell. "I'm a financial advisor for Tech Vista, Marcus," I said, stepping closer to him. "I don't just know how to use money. I know the people who build the walls around it. Silas didn't just find you. He found your keys." Marcus let out a low, guttural growl. He looked at Audrey, then at Betty, then back at me. I could see the gears turning. He was looking for an exit. He was looking for a weapon. He lunged for the knife on the dinner platter, his movement a blur of speed. But he was too late. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Blue and red lights began to flicker against the rain-streaked windows. "It's over," I said, my hand finally moving to the grip of the revolver behind my back. But as the police pulled into the driveway, Audrey did something I never expected. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She picked up the heavy crystal wine decanter from the table and, with a scream of pure, primal rage, swung it with everything she had. What happened next changed the entire case and ensured that none of us would ever be the same. The crystal decanter didn't just break, it exploded. The sound of heavy leaded glass colliding with the side of Marcus's head was a sickening wet thud that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die. It was followed immediately by the chiming of 1,000 glass shards raining down onto the mahogany table and the hardwood floor. Marcus's head snapped to the side, and for a heartbeat, he looked more surprised than hurt. Then, the blood began to flow dark, heavy, and immediate, streaming down his temple and soaking into the collar of his expensive button-down shirt. He didn't go down, not at first. He staggered, his hand flying to the side of his face, his eyes wide and unfocused. Audrey stood there, the broken neck of the decanter still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving, her face a mask of primal, jagged hatred. She wasn't my little girl anymore. She wasn't the honors student or the marketing intern. She was a cornered animal realizing that the person she'd trusted to help her escape the cage was the one who had locked the door. "You son of a bitch!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat like a physical wound. "You used me, you used us, my father, the money, all of it was just for you." Marcus let out a low, ragged laugh that turned into a cough. He spat blood onto the white tablecloth, the one Betty's mother had hand-embroidered for us. He looked at the red stain, then slowly turned his gaze back to Audrey. The charming Evan was gone. In his place was something cold, calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. What happened next changed the entire trajectory of my survival, because I realized that Marcus wasn't the only one who had been holding a secret weapon. "Used you?" Marcus rasped, his voice bubbling with a terrifying calm. He ignored the blood pouring down his face, leaning his weight against the table. "Audrey, honey, you were the one who approached me, don't forget that. You were the one in the Pearl District bar, complaining about your stingy father and your boring mother. You were the one who told me exactly which accounts he kept his play money in. I just provided the expertise." He looked at Betty, who was huddled in her chair, her eyes fixed on the blood on the table. "And you, Betty, you were so easy. A few compliments, a little attention to the lonely nights Joseph left you with, and you were practically handing me the keys to the safe. You didn't care about Audrey's startup. You just wanted to feel young again. You wanted to be the lead in a movie where you weren't just the accountant's wife." "Shut up," Betty whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "Why? The truth is so much more interesting than the lie, isn't it?" Marcus stepped toward her, his movement slow and predatory. "Did you tell Joseph whose idea the accidental death clause really was? Because it wasn't mine. I was happy with the equity. It was Audrey. She's the one who wanted the full $3 million. She's the one who said, 'If we're going to do this, let's do it right. Let's make sure he doesn't come back to find us.'" I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Audrey. She was still holding the broken glass, her knuckles white. She didn't deny it. She didn't even look at me. She just stared at Marcus with a focused, murderous intent. "I did it for us," she hissed at him. "I did it so we'd never have to look back." "No, Audrey," Marcus said, his smile turning razor sharp. "You did it for yourself, just like I did, and just like your mother did." The sirens were deafening now, the red and blue pulses of light strobing through the room like a sick disco. The front door was kicked open, the sound of heavy boots echoing through the foyer. "Police! Don't move!" The room dissolved into a chaotic blur of motion. 2 officers burst into the dining room, their weapons drawn, their voices a cacophony of commands. "Hands in the air! Drop the glass, now!" Audrey let the broken decanter fall. It hit the floor with a dull clink. Marcus didn't even try to run. He just stood there, his hands raised, blood still dripping from his chin, looking at me with an expression that wasn't fear, it was pity. I didn't know it yet, but that look was the final piece of the puzzle I had been too blind to solve. As the officers moved in, pinning Marcus against the wall and forcing Audrey and Betty to their knees, the lead detective, a gray-haired man named Miller, whom I'd met once at a city council meeting, approached me. He looked at the gun I'd pulled from my blazer and set on the table. Then he looked at the wreckage of my family. "Mr. Barrett," Miller said, his voice strangely gentle amid the noise. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," I said, though the word felt like a lie. I felt like I was made of glass and someone had just shattered me. "We have the evidence from the fixer you contacted," Miller said, gesturing to the laptop. "And we have the recorded calls from the burner phone. We're taking them all into custody. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder, it's a heavy list." I watched them cuff Marcus. I watched them lead Betty out, her head bowed, her silk dress stained with her daughter's rage. I watched them take Audrey. As she passed me, she stopped. She looked me in the eyes, and for a second, I thought I saw the girl I used to take to the park, the one who'd cry if she scraped her knee. "You should have just given me the money, Dad," she whispered, her voice devoid of any warmth. "It would have been so much cheaper." The door closed behind them, and suddenly, the house was silent. The police were still outside. The forensic team was starting to move in, but in the dining room, it was just me and the silence. I sat down in my chair. The wine I'd poured was still in the glass. I picked it up and took a sip, the cold liquid tasting like nothing. My mind was spinning, replaying Marcus's words. "You didn't care about Audrey's startup. You just wanted to feel young." It was Audrey. She's the one who wanted the full $3 million. I looked at the documents on the table. The E.A. Legacy Fund. I realized then that I had focused so much on the E for Evan and the A for Audrey. I'd missed something vital. I reached for my phone and called Silas. "Joseph, I thought you were busy being a hero," Silas said, his voice sounding tired. "The police have them, Silas," I said, "but I need you to look at something else. The A. Legacy Fund. I assumed the E was for Evan. But Evan's real name is Marcus. Why would he use his fake name for the fund? He's too professional for that. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the rhythmic clicking of Silas's keyboard. "You're right," Silas said finally. "Marcus Thorne doesn't use his aliases for his long-term holdings. It's too risky. Give me a minute." I waited, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I looked around the room at the broken glass, the blood, the chair where my wife had sat for 24 years. I felt a cold realization starting to settle in my bones. "Okay, Joseph, I've got it," Silas said. His voice was different now, softer, more cautious. "The E.A. Legacy Fund was registered 3 years ago. Not 18 months ago. 3 years. 3 years? I asked. That was before Marcus was even in the picture. Exactly. The E isn't for Evan, Joseph. And the A isn't just for Audrey. Then who? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I could feel it in the way the air in the room seemed to turn to ice. "The fund was set up by a partnership," Silas said. "The E is for Elizabeth, your wife's middle name, and the A is for Audrey. They started this 3 years ago, Joseph, long before they met Marcus. He didn't corrupt them. He didn't come in and ruin a happy family. They were already looking for a way out. They hired him." I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the table, landing in a pool of spilt wine. The betrayal I had discovered in Salem, the one I thought was a recent, tragic turn, was just the final act of a play that had been running for years. My wife and daughter hadn't been seduced by a con man. They had sought one out. They had been shopping for a way to kill me and take my life's work for 3 years. Every "I love you," every anniversary gift, every family vacation since then had been a calculated performance. I stood up, my legs trembling. I walked to the window and watched the forensic team's flashbulbs popping in the driveway. My family was gone. My money was mostly gone. My trust was a smoking ruin. But then, I saw something in the driveway that shouldn't have been there. A white van was parked across the street, just outside the police perimeter. A man was sitting in the driver's seat, his face illuminated by the glow of a tablet. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a reporter. He was wearing the same high-end athletic gear Marcus had worn. He looked at the house, then he looked directly at me through the window. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look worried. He raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Then he put the van in gear and drove away. I realized then that Marcus wasn't the head of the snake. He was just a soldier, and the people who had truly orchestrated my destruction were still out there, waiting for the smoke to clear. I picked up the phone again. "Silas? We're not done. Not even close." "Joseph, the police have the primary suspects," Silas said. "What else do you want?" "I want the person who hired Marcus," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as the broken glass on the floor. "Because if Elizabeth and Audrey set up that fund 3 years ago, they needed a broker. Someone who knew Marcus. Someone who knew exactly how much my firm was worth." I looked at the Tech Vista proposal sitting on the sideboard, the one I'd worked on for 6 months. I remembered who had introduced me to the CEO of Tech Vista. I remembered who had encouraged me to move all my personal assets into the Vanguard account for streamlining. My business partner, my best friend, the man who had been my best man at the wedding. I didn't know it yet, but the man I was about to call for help was the one who had written the script for my death. The silence that followed the departure of the police was more violent than the sirens ever were. My house, once a sanctuary of curated success, felt like a hollowed-out ribcage. The forensic team moved through the dining room like vultures, dusting for prints on the broken crystal and bagging the documents that had been the blueprints for my execution. I stood in the corner of my office, the shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor, clutching the phone like a lifeline to a world that no longer existed. "Silas," I whispered into the receiver, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. "Richard. Tell me it isn't Richard." Silas didn't answer right away. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic clicking of keys from his end, the sound of a man dismantling lives one bite at a time. "Richard Vance," Silas finally said, his voice flat. "Your partner of 15 years. The man who sat in the front row at your wedding. He's the one who set up the shell company in the Caymans for the E.A. Legacy Fund. But Joseph, There's something else. The funds aren't just coming from your personal accounts anymore. He's been diverting client retainers into that fund for 6 months. He wasn't just helping them rob you. He's using this to tank the entire firm so he can buy out your shares for pennies during the bankruptcy. I felt a coldness settle into my marrow that no heater could ever touch. Richard. We had started Vance and Barrett in a cramped 2-room office with nothing but a shared vision and a mountain of student debt. We had toasted to every milestone with expensive scotch, thinking we were brothers in arms. I didn't know it then, but every glass we clinked was a celebration of how much closer he was to burying me. "He's coming over, isn't he?" Silas asked. "He called 10 minutes ago," I said, glancing at the security monitor. "He said he heard about the incident on the scanner. Said he was coming to support me." "Play the part, Joseph," Silas warned. "If he thinks you suspect him, he'll trigger the final sweep. He still has administrative access to the firm's main servers. If he hits the delete key on the compliance records, the feds won't care that you were a victim. They'll see a man whose family stole millions and a firm with no records. You'll be the one in the orange jumpsuit." I hung up just as a set of headlights swept across the office walls. A sleek, charcoal gray BMW pulled into the driveway, parking exactly where the police van had been minutes before. Richard Vance stepped out, his movements practiced and elegant. He was wearing a cashmere overcoat, his face pinched in a look of profound, manufactured grief. He looked like the perfect friend. I met him at the door before he could ring the bell. I made sure my eyes were bloodshot, my tie loosened, my posture slumped. I needed to be the broken man he expected. "Joe," he breathed, stepping inside and pulling me into a brief, firm hug. He smelled of expensive cedar wood and the rain. I came as soon as I heard. "My God, man. Betty, Audrey, I can't believe it. I refuse to believe it." "They're gone, Rich," I said, my voice cracking a performance that felt terrifyingly close to the truth. "The police, they took them. They had recordings, forgeries. It's all a mess." I led him into the living room, avoiding the dining room where the blood still stained the floorboards. Richard sat on the leather sofa, the same one where he'd sat during our last Super Bowl party, laughing and eating wings. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "The police mentioned a man," Richard said, his eyes searching mine. "An accomplice?" "Marcus Thorne," I said, watching him closely. "He was the one they were working with. He's in custody, too." Richard didn't flinch, but I saw a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in his jaw. "Marcus Thorne? Never heard of him. Some low-life con artist, I imagine." "Listen, Joe, you need to think about the firm. When this hits the news, and it will, our clients are going to panic. We need to protect the assets. We need to move the primary accounts to a secure holding today." He was moving fast. Too fast. He wanted me to sign over the last of my authority while I was still reeling. What happened next was the first real test of my new life as a liar. "You're right," I said, wiping my face with a trembling hand. "I can't even think straight, Rich. I've lost my family. I can't lose the firm too. Whatever you think is best, just tell me what to do." A flicker of something triumph, perhaps shone in Richard's eyes for a fraction of a second. "I've got the emergency transition papers in the car. Just a few signatures to give me temporary sole oversight while you know, handle the legal fallout with Betty. I'll sign whatever you need," I whispered. "But Rich, why? Why would they do this? Betty, she had everything." Richard sighed, a long, mournful sound. He reached out and patted my knee. "People are greedy, Joe. Even the ones we love. They see the success, the money, and they don't see the man. They just see the prize. You're too good for them. You always were." The hypocrisy was so thick it was a wonder I could breathe. He went out to his car to get the papers, and I stood at the window, watching his silhouette in the rain. I realized then that Richard wasn't just the broker. He was the architect. He had whispered in Betty's ear for years about my neglect. He had likely been the one to introduce Audrey to the investors who led her to Marcus. He had dismantled my family brick by brick, all to get his hands on the vault. He came back in with a leather folio. He spread the papers out on the coffee table. These weren't just transition papers. They were a full surrender of my equity in exchange for legal protection provided by the firm. If I signed these, I'd be penniless by morning. and Richard would own the most successful mid-sized firm in the Pacific Northwest. "Just sign here, Joe," he said, handing me a heavy gold pen, the one I'd given him for his 40th birthday. "I'll take care of the rest. You just go upstairs and get some rest." I picked up the pen. The gold was cold in my hand. I looked at the signature line. I could hear Silas's voice in my head. "Play the part." "Wait," I said, squinting at the fine print. "This says the transfer is immediate. Shouldn't we wait until the board meets on Monday?" Richard's smile didn't waver, but his voice tightened. "Monday is too late, Joe. The news will break in the morning. We need the accounts locked down before the banks open. Trust me. Haven't I always had your back?" "You have," I said. I lowered the pen toward the paper. My heart was thudding so hard against my ribs I thought it might bruise. Just then, my phone buzzed on the table between us. It was a text from an unknown number. The preview was visible on the screen. "Unknown. Don't sign. Look at the back of the folio." Richard saw the flash of the screen, but he didn't see the text. He frowned. "Is that the police again?" "Just a client," I said, my pulse skyrocketing. I shifted the folio slightly, as if to get a better angle for signing. As I flipped the last page to the back, I saw it. Tucked into a small pocket in the leather was a photograph. It was a candid shot, taken from a distance. It showed Richard and Audrey sitting in a dark corner of a restaurant I recognized, but they weren't talking about business. Richard was holding Audrey's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a way that was undeniably intimate. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. The room seemed to tilt. My partner wasn't just the broker. He wasn't just the thief. He was the one sleeping with my daughter while he encouraged her to kill me. I didn't know it yet, but the person who sent that text was the only person in the world who hated Richard Vance more than I did. "Is something wrong, Joe?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly sharp. He reached for the folio, but I pulled it back. "I just realized I don't have my reading glasses," I said, standing up. "I can't sign what I can't see, Rich. Let me go grab them from the office." "I'll come with you," Richard said, standing up too. His mask was slipping. The concerned friend was being replaced by the impatient predator. "No, stay there," I said, forced a smile that felt like a scar. "I'll be right back. It's just in the desk." I walked into the office and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the desk to stay upright. I looked at the phone. The unknown number was calling now. I answered it. "Who is this?" I hissed. "A friend," a woman's voice said. She sounded young, breathless, and terrified. "My name is Megan, Marcus's wife. I told you I was coming to the house, but I'm not alone. Richard, he didn't just hire my husband, Joseph. He's been using Marcus to funnel money into a second trust, one that Audrey doesn't know about, one that Betty doesn't know about." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because Richard told Marcus that once the accident happened, he was going to kill Marcus too. He wanted all the evidence gone. He wanted the girls, the firm, and the money. My husband is a thief, Joseph, but he's not a murderer. He kept a recording of Richard giving the order to cut your brake lines. He kept it as insurance." I looked at the office door. I could hear Richard's footsteps in the hallway. He wasn't waiting in the living room. He was standing right outside the door. "Joe," Richard's voice was low, dangerous. "What are you doing in there? Open the door." "The recording," I whispered into the phone. "Where is it?" "It's in Richard's car," Megan said. "In the glove box, hidden behind the manual. Get it, Joseph. It's the only thing that will save you." I looked at the window. The rain was still coming down in sheets. Richard began to rattle the doorknob. "Joseph, I'm starting to think you're not being a very good partner," Richard said, and for the first time, I heard the true malice in his voice. "Open the door, or I'm going to have to explain to the police how the stress of your family's betrayal drove you to a very tragic, very permanent decision." I realized then that he wasn't here to help me sign papers. He was here to finish what the T and the brake lines hadn't. He was here to stage my suicide. I looked at the desk drawer. The revolver was gone. The police had taken it as evidence. I had no weapon. I had no backup. I only had the window and a 60-foot dash to a car that held the proof of my partner's soul-deep betrayal. What happened next was a gamble that would either set me free or bury me in the mud of my own backyard. I didn't answer him. I grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from the desk, smashed the window glass, and vaulted out into the night. The world didn't just break when I hit the ground. It shattered into a million wet, jagged pieces. I landed hard on the mulch of the flower bed, the breath driven out of my lungs in a violent, silent explosion. Pain flared through my shoulder and hip, a white-hot lightning bolt that reminded me I was 56 and no longer the athlete I'd been in college. The rain was coming down in a relentless curtain now, soaking through my silk-lined blazer in seconds, turning the expensive fabric into a heavy, freezing second skin. I lay there for a heartbeat, my face pressed into the damp cedar chips, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Above me, through the jagged frame of the broken office window, I heard the door splinter. Richard had kicked it in. "Joseph," his voice roared. No longer the polished, velvet baritone of a partner. It was the sound of a man who had seen his prize slipping away and was ready to tear it back with his bare hands. "You think you can run? In this weather? To where?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I forced myself to my knees, my vision swimming with dark spots. My office was on the ground floor, but the drop had been enough to jar every bone in my body. I looked toward the driveway. The charcoal BMW sat there, a dark, sleek beast idling in the shadows. 60 feet. It looked like 60 miles. I scrambled up, my shoes slipping on the wet grass. I didn't run with grace. I lunged forward. A wounded animal driven by the singular, burning need to find that recording. I reached the car just as the back door of the house flew open. Richard stepped onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the warm light of the foyer, the light I had paid for, in the house I had built, while he was planning to bury me in the backyard. "Get away from the car, Joe," he screamed. He was reaching into his overcoat. I didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. The BMW was locked. My heart plummeted. Of course it was locked. But then I remembered Richard's one true weakness, his vanity. He loved technology, but he hated the inconvenience of it. He'd bragged a month ago about his new proximity key, how the car would unlock the moment he was within 10 feet of it. He was standing on the porch. That was 20 feet. I grabbed the door handle and pulled. Nothing. I looked back at him. He was stepping off the porch, his face contorted in a mask of pure, murderous intent. He took 3 steps toward me. Click. The mirrors folded out. The interior lights flickered on. The car had recognized him. It was the only thing in this world that still did. I dove into the passenger seat, my hands frantic, sliding over the polished leather. I ripped open the glove box. A stack of papers spilled out, napkins from a steakhouse, a spare pair of Ray-Bans, the vehicle manual. I shoved my hand behind the manual, my fingers grazing something hard and plastic. A digital recorder. I pulled it out just as the driver's side door was yanked open. Richard was there, his face dripping with rain, his eyes wild. He reached across the seat, his fingers clawing for my throat. "Give it to me, you pathetic piece of trash," he snarled. I kicked out, my heel catching him square in the chest. He grunted, stumbling back into the mud. I scrambled out the passenger side, clutching the recorder to my chest like a holy relic. I didn't run for the street. I ran for the woods at the edge of my property. I knew those woods. I'd spent 20 years clearing the brush, building a trail for Audrey when she was a little girl. I didn't know it yet, but the trail I built for her childhood would be the place where I finally ended her future. I dove into the thicket of Douglas firs, the branches scratching at my face. I stopped behind a massive trunk, my heart thudding so hard I thought my ribs would snap. I looked at the recorder. It was a high-end Sony, the kind private investigators use. I hit the play button with a trembling thumb. At first, there was only static. Then, the sound of a car engine. "The brake lines are done," a voice said. "Marcus. But he's a good driver, Richard. If he doesn't hit a wall at 60, he might just coast to a stop." Then we moved to phase 2. Richard's voice came through, clear as a bell, devoid of any emotion. "The tea. Audrey is already prepping the sedatives. She's remarkably cold-blooded when she wants something, isn't she? Must take after her mother." Marcus laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "And once he's dead, we move the Tech Vista funds? Once he's dead, the firm belongs to me. You get your cut, and the girls get their inheritance in the Caymans. Just make sure the accident looks clean. I don't need the insurance company sniffing around my new office." The recording clicked off. I leaned my head against the bark of the tree, a sob racking my body. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a cold, calculated contract on my life, signed by my best friend and co-signed by my daughter. Joe. Richard's voice was closer now. He was in the woods. I could hear the snap of twigs, the heavy squelch of his boots in the mud. I know you have it. But who's going to believe you? I'm the respectable partner. You're the man whose wife and daughter were just arrested for fraud. You're the one with the motive to forge a recording to save your own skin. He was right. In the eyes of the law, I was currently the captain of a sinking ship. My credibility was in the basement with the rest of my life. I needed more than a recording. I needed a total collapse of his world. I pulled out my phone. My screen was cracked from the jump, but it still glowed. I called Silas. I have it, I whispered. But he's right. He'll bury the recording in legal challenges. I need the second trust, Silas. The one he kept from the girls. The one with his name on it. I'm already in, Joseph, Silas said. But to trigger a federal freeze, I need a direct authorization from your firm's compliance server. I need your biometric key. I'm in the woods, Silas. I don't have my key. The app on your phone, Silas hissed. The one you use for remote wire transfers. If you can bypass the firewall with your fingerprint and the firm's master code, I can link Richard's personal trust to the stolen client funds. It will flag the Treasury Department instantly. He won't just be a murderer, he'll be a traitor to the banking system. They'll seize everything he's ever touched. I looked at the phone. My fingerprint. The master code. The master code was our anniversary the day Vance and Barrett was founded. I heard a rustle of leaves 10 feet away. I looked up. Richard was standing there, a heavy flashlight in one hand and a tire iron in the other. He looked like a nightmare brought to life. Give it to me, Joe, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Last chance. We can still fix this. We can blame everything on Marcus. We can say he manipulated all of us. I'll help you get the best lawyers for Betty. We can go back to the way it was. The way it was? I asked, my voice steadying. I held the phone up, my thumb hovering over the sensor. You mean the way where you were sleeping with my daughter while you were planning to cut my brake lines? That way? Richard's face hardened. The mask of friendship didn't just slip, it shattered. She was bored, Joe. She wanted a man who understood her ambition, not a father who treated her like a tax deduction. And Betty? She just wanted to be seen. You were too busy looking at spreadsheets to notice your own wife was starving for a real man. He lunged. I didn't run. I stepped into his swing, the tire iron whistling past my ear. I drove my shoulder into his chest, the two of us crashing into the mud. We rolled, a tangle of limbs and wet wool. He was stronger, but I was fueled by a decade of repressed rage. I thumbed the sensor on my phone even as his hands found my throat. Authentication successful. Silas, now! I screamed. Richard slammed my head into the ground. White light exploded in my vision. He pinned me down, his knees on my arms, his face inches from mine. He was grinning now, a jagged, terrifying expression of triumph. Too late, Joe. Even if you sent something, I'll be gone before the feds can find me. And you? You're going to be the tragic victim of a home invasion. The accomplices came back to finish the job. He raised the tire iron high above his head. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. I thought of Audrey. I thought of the way she used to hold my hand when she was afraid of the dark. I wondered if she'd feel anything when she heard her father's skull had been crushed in the woods. But the blow never came. Instead, the woods were suddenly flooded with a blinding, artificial white light. The sound of a loudspeaker tore through the trees. Portland PD dropped the weapon. Get on the ground now. Richard froze. He looked toward the light, his jaw dropping. I looked past him. It wasn't just the police. Standing behind the lead officer was a woman I recognized. Megan, Marcus's wife. She was holding a tablet, her face set in a grim, determined line. I told you I was coming, Joseph, she shouted, and I brought the SEC with me. They've been tracking Richard's second trust for months. They just needed the biometric link to prove it was stolen money. Richard scrambled up, trying to run, but he didn't get 5 steps before the K9 unit was on him. The sound of his screams echoed through the Douglas firs, the sound of a man who had finally realized that the idiot had been the one holding the leash all along. I stayed on the ground, the rain washing the mud and blood from my face. I watched them cuff him. I watched them lead him away. The man who had been my brother, now just another inmate in a world he thought he was too smart to inhabit. Detective Miller walked over and offered me a hand. I took it, pulling myself up with a groan. "We have the recording, Mr. Barrett," Miller said, holding up the Sony device I'd dropped in the struggle. "And we have the server logs. It's over." "It's not over," I said, looking toward the house. "There's still the matter of the EA Legacy Fund. I want it liquidated. Every penny. I want it donated to the victims of romance scams. And I want the firm's shares moved to a trust for Megan's children. They're the only ones in this story who didn't choose to be vipers." Miller nodded. "We'll handle the paperwork. You need a hospital, Joe?" "No," I said, looking at the dark silhouette of my home. "I need a drink, and I need to change my locks." I walked back toward the house, my steps slow and painful. I passed the spot where the lilies had fallen in the mud. I picked one up. It was crushed, stained, and broken. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest part of my revenge wasn't going to be sending them to prison. It was going to be the silence of the first morning I woke up alone. As I reached the porch, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Unknown. You did well, Joseph, but you should check the safe in the office again. The floorboards beneath it." Richard wasn't the only one keeping an insurance policy. I stood in the foyer, the rain dripping from my hair, and looked at the office door. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just changing shape. I stepped back inside my house, but it didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum of a life that had never actually existed. The air was cold, smelling of rain and the sharp metallic scent of the forensic chemicals the police had left behind. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to stretch out like a finger pointing at my own blindness. I was a man who had built a career on meticulous attention to detail. Yet, I had lived in a house made of smoke and mirrors for 24 years. I walked toward my office, my boots squelching with every step, leaving a trail of mud and Douglas fir needles on the expensive Persian rug. I didn't care. The rug was just another piece of the hero's stage, and the play was over. I pushed open the shattered office door. The wind was still whistling through the broken window, making the curtains dance like ghosts. I looked at the safe. It sat there, heavy and mocking, bolted to the wall. I'd always felt so secure knowing my most important documents were behind 6 inches of reinforced steel. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolkit in the mudroom and came back, my breath hitching in my throat. I didn't know who sent that text, but the precision of it felt like a final, twisted gift. I jammed the crowbar into the seam of the hardwood floorboards directly beneath the safe. The wood groaned, a long, agonizing screech that echoed through the empty house. I pulled with everything I had, the muscles in my back screaming in protest. The first board snapped, then the second. Beneath the subfloor, tucked into a space between the joists, was a small, rusted metal box. It wasn't high-tech. It wasn't encrypted. It was a simple, old-fashioned lockbox, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $20. I didn't need a key. A heavy blow from the crowbar snapped the latch. I thought I had hit rock bottom in the woods, but as I opened that box, I realized I was still falling. Inside were letters, dozens of them. They weren't from Marcus. They weren't from some random accomplice. They were from Richard, and they were dated back 25 years. I picked up the first one, my fingers trembling so badly the paper rattled like dry leaves. It was dated 6 months before Betty and I got married. "Betty, my love, I know the plan is difficult. Watching you walk down the aisle with Joseph will be the hardest thing I've ever done. But remember why we're doing this. He's the golden boy. He has the inheritance, the connections, and the stable future we need. We're not just building a firm, we're building a kingdom. He'll be the face, he'll be the workhorse, and we'll be the ones who actually own the throne. Just play the part a little longer. I'll be waiting in the shadows until we can finally take what's ours." I felt a roar of static in my ears. The room began to spin. 25 years. This wasn't a recent betrayal. This wasn't an emotional neglect issue. This was a long con that started before I even said I do. Richard hadn't just stepped in to exploit a crumbling marriage. He had curated my life. He had handpicked the woman I loved to be his inside agent. I dug deeper into the box. There were photos, candid shots of Richard and Betty in places I didn't recognize. A cabin in the Cascades. A small hotel in Florence during a business trip I thought I'd taken alone. They looked happy. They looked like the couple I thought Betty and I were. Then, I found the final envelope. It was thick, heavy, and sealed with wax. On the front, in Betty's elegant cursive, were the words, "In case Richard forgets who really holds the power." I tore it open. Inside was a legal document, a DNA maternity and paternity test. I looked at the names. Audrey Barrett, Joseph Barrett, Richard Vance. My heart didn't just break. It felt like it had been shredded. I looked at the results. The probability of Joseph Barrett being the biological father, 0%. The probability of Richard Vance being the biological father, 99.9%. I sank to the floor, the paper fluttering from my hand like a dead bird. Audrey wasn't mine. The girl I'd held in the delivery room, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike, the girl I'd spent every waking hour trying to protect. She was the physical manifestation of my best friend and my wife's decades-long betrayal. I didn't know it yet, but the man I was an hour ago, the man who wanted justice, died right there on that muddy floor. What took his place was a man who wanted to erase them from existence. I sat in the dark for hours, the rain finally tapering off to a dull drizzle. I thought about every moment of Audrey's life, every time Richard had dropped by with a gift for her, every time he'd offered to take her to a ball game when I was stuck at work. I thought he was being a good godfather. He was being a father. And they had let me pay for every bit of it, the private school, the orthodontics, the trust fund, all while they laughed behind my back. The realization was a cold, numbing poison. I looked at the photos of them again. They had been a family all along. I was just the financier. I was the host for their parasite. Suddenly my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the local news. Breaking. High-profile arrest of Richard Vance and the family of financial advisor Joseph Barrett in connection to multi-million-dollar fraud and attempted murder. The world was starting to see the surface of the story, but they would never see the depths of the depravity I was holding in my hands. I stood up, my joints stiff, my mind moving with a new, terrifying clarity. If Richard and Betty had spent 25 years playing me, then I would spend the rest of my life ensuring their legacy was a pile of ash. I picked up the phone and called Silas. "Joseph, it's 4 a.m. What now?" Silas sounded like he was on the edge of exhaustion. "I need you to leak the DNA results," I said, my voice as flat as a tombstone. "What?" "Joseph, that's personal. That involves Audrey." "Audrey tried to kill me, Silas. She isn't my daughter. She's Richard's. I want the world to know that the golden partner, Richard Vance, impregnated his partner's fiancée and then used that partner to fund his daughter's life for 23 years. I want the SEC, the IRS, and every client we've ever had to see the absolute lack of character in that man. And I want the Legacy Fund to be renamed." "To what?" Silas asked. "The Betrayal Restitution Fund," I said. "And I want you to find the documents Richard used to hide his real assets. The ones he didn't even tell Betty about. I know they exist, Silas. A man like that always has a backup for his backup. I'm on it." Silas said, "But Joseph, what are you going to do? By teen-person teller?" "I'm going to visit Betty," I said. "I want her to see my face one last time before she disappears into the system." The next morning, I was at the Multnomah County Jail. I looked a mess. The mud had dried on my suit. My face was bruised, and my eyes were bloodshot, but I'd never felt more focused. I sat in the visitation room, the glass partition between us cold and thick. Betty was brought in. She looked small in the orange jumpsuit, her hair limp, her face stripped of the expensive creams and confidence that had defined her. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling. "Joseph," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. Richard, he manipulated me. He told me you didn't love me anymore. He said—" "I found the box, Betty," I interrupted. She froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a marble statue of a sinner. 25 years, I said. my voice echoing in the small booth. I wasn't the neglectful husband. I was the target. You and Richard. You've been together since before the wedding. You let me raise his child. You let me love her. You let me think I was a father. Joseph, I did love you, in my own way, she sobbed, the tears carving tracks through the grime on her cheeks. But Richard, he was my first love. He promised us a life where we didn't have to work. He said you were the way to get there. You're right, I said, leaning closer to the glass. I was the way. And now, I'm the way you're going to spend the next 20 years in a 6x9 cell. I've already turned over the letters to the DA. They're adding aggravated fraud and criminal conspiracy to the list. And I've initiated a total disinheritance of Audrey. She's no longer my daughter, legally or otherwise. She's Richard's problem now. No, Betty gasped. She has nothing. You can't leave her with nothing. She has exactly what her biological father gave her, I said. A legacy of lies and a prison sentence. And Betty, I'm selling the house. I'm selling everything. I'm going to use the money to fund a foundation for people who have been victims of white-collar crime. Your name will be on the donated by the estate of Betrayal plaque. I stood up, the phone still in my hand. You thought I was the idiot, Betty. But an idiot is someone who doesn't see the truth. A man who sees the truth and still chooses to move forward, that's a man you should have been afraid of. I hung up the phone. I didn't look back as the guards led her away. I walked out of the jail and into the bright, cold sunlight of a Portland autumn. I looked at the city, the buildings gleaming in the distance. My firm was gone. My family was gone. My life was a fiction. But as I reached my car, I saw a familiar figure leaning against the door. It was Megan, Marcus's wife. She looked tired, but there was a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. I heard about the letters, she said. The news is already picking it up. Richard is done, Joseph. He'll never see the outside of a prison again. It doesn't feel like enough, I said. It never does, she replied. But Marcus told me something once. He said the best way to destroy a man like Richard isn't to take his freedom, it's to take his audience. Without someone to impress, a man like that just withers. I looked at her, and for the first time in 24 years, I felt a genuine connection to another human being. We were both survivors of the same den of vipers. What now? I asked. Now, Megan said, we make sure the vipers don't have anything left to eat. I found Marcus's secret ledger, the one he kept in Vancouver. It has the names of the brokers Richard used to move the Tech Vista money. If we move fast, we can get it back before it hits the offshore accounts. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The hero was dead, but the auditor was very much alive. I didn't know it yet, but the final reversal wasn't going to happen in a courtroom. It was going to happen in a small, nondescript office in the Caymans, where I was about to perform the greatest audit of my career. Let's go, I said. The flight to the Grand Cayman was a blur of blue ocean and gray spreadsheets. I sat in the first-class cabin, but I wasn't drinking champagne. I was staring at an encrypted tablet, watching the digital ghosts of my life's work flicker across the screen. Megan sat next to me, her face reflected in the dark glass of the window. We were two people who had been hollowed out by the same set of monsters, and in that shared emptiness, we had found a strange, clinical partnership. I didn't know it yet, but the final piece of the audit wasn't hidden in a bank vault. It was hidden in the memory of a man I thought I had buried years ago. Silas had been right. Richard Vance was a man of infinite contingencies. He hadn't just moved the money. He'd layered it through a series of escrow accounts that required a physical token to release. That token wasn't a digital key. It was a physical ledger, a black book that Marcus had mentioned to Megan during one of his late-night drunken boasts. He told her it was kept in a safe deposit box at a private bank in Georgetown, registered under the name of a dead man, my father. The audacity of it made my skin crawl. Richard hadn't just stolen my money and my wife. He had stolen my father's identity to house the loot. Finally, Procon, and replier, with I was offers of 2,000, with thou. It was the ultimate insult, a final forget you, from the man who had been my best man. When we landed, The heat hit me like a physical blow, thick, humid, and smelling of salt and expensive cigars. We went straight to the bank. I was wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized car, and I carried a power of attorney that Silas had verified through the firm's back channels. I walked in as the executor of my father's estate. My heart was a cold, steady drumbeat in my chest. I wasn't the idiot anymore. I was the reaper. The bank manager was a polished man with a British accent and eyes that didn't blink. He led us into the private vault. The air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, the smell of dust and old paper filling the space. He pulled out the box. "Here you are, Mr. Barrett," he said, sliding the metal container onto a velvet-lined table. "I trust everything is in order?" "It will be," I said. I opened the box. Inside was the ledger. I flipped through the pages. It was all there. Every wire transfer, every bribe, every cent that had been siphoned from Vance and Barrett over the last decade. But as I reached the final page, I saw something that stopped the blood in my veins. There was a letter, tucked into a pocket in the back cover. It was written on my firm's stationery, dated 2 weeks ago, the night before the heart attack in Salem. "Joseph, if you're reading this, it means you finally woke up. I honestly didn't think you had it in you. I thought you'd just drink the tea and go quietly into that good night. But since you're here, I should tell you the truth. Richard didn't start this. I did." The handwriting wasn't Richard's. It was Walter's. Betty's father. My father-in-law. I felt a wave of vertigo so strong I had to grip the edge of the table. Walter, the man who had shaken my hand, the man who had called me son. Richard was just the tool, Joseph. He was greedy and arrogant, easy to point in the right direction. Betty was just a dreamer. But you were the threat. You were too honest. You were going to audit the family trust, and you were going to find out that I'd been skimming from your firm's construction contracts since day one. I needed you gone, but I needed it to be legal. I needed you to be the villain. I'm sorry it had to end this way, but legacy is a messy business. Don't bother coming back to Salem. The house is already sold, and the records are ash. I dropped the letter. The bank manager looked at me, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Fine," I rasped. "Everything is exactly as it should be." I realized then that the gate being left open in Salem hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been Walter choosing me. It had been a trap. He wanted me to find them. He wanted the confrontation. He wanted the police involved. Because while I was busy dealing with a murder attempt and a fraud case against my wife and daughter, Walter was busy liquidating the real prize, the multi-million-dollar family trust that I had helped build. He had sacrificed his own daughter and granddaughter to save his own skin. He had used Richard as a lightning rod, knowing that I would go after my partner with everything I had. I didn't know it yet, but Walter had underestimated one thing. A man who has lost everything has nothing left to fear. I looked at Megan. She saw the look in my eyes. "What is it?" "We're going to Salem," I said. "But we're not going to the house. We're going to the docks." We flew back to Oregon that night. I didn't go home. I didn't go to the police. I went to the marina where Walter kept his pride and joy, a 40-foot sailboat named the Mildred. It was 2 a.m., the docks slick with the usual Portland rain. I saw the lights on in the cabin. I walked onto the dock, my footsteps silent. I didn't have a gun. I didn't need one. I had the ledger from the Caymans. I had the proof that would send an 80-year-old man to a place far worse than the hospital. I stepped onto the deck. The boat swayed gently. I pushed open the hatch and looked down into the cabin. Walter was there, a glass of scotch in his hand, a suitcase open on the bench next to him. He looked up, and for the first time in 24 years, I saw the true face of the man. It wasn't the face of a grandfather. It was the face of a shark. "You're late, Joseph," he said, his voice as steady as a rock. "I expected you yesterday." "The Caymans took longer than I thought," I said, stepping down into the cabin. I set the ledger on the table. "I found your letter, Walter." It was a nice touch. The idiot almost believed it. Walter chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You were never an idiot, Joseph. You were just a man who wanted to believe in the fairy tale. You wanted the wife, the daughter, the partner. You wanted the white picket fence so badly you didn't notice the termites." "I noticed the termites," I said. I just didn't realize they were the ones who built the house. So what now? Walter asked, gesturing to the suitcase. You going to call the police? An old man with a heart condition? My lawyer will have me out on medical bail before you can even file the report. And the money? It's gone, Joseph. Scattered to the wind. I'm not calling the police, Walter, I said. I pulled out my phone and hit a button. The interior of the boat was suddenly flooded with light, not from the police, but from a series of high-intensity floodlights mounted on the dock. I saw a group of men in dark suits standing there, not cops. Feds. I called the IRS, Walter, I said. I didn't tell them about the murder attempt or the fraud. I told them about the skimming. I told them about the 20 years of unpaid taxes on the family trust. I told them about the offshore accounts in my father's name. They don't care about your heart condition. They only care about their cut. Walter's face finally cracked. The Scotch glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. And I did one more thing, I said, leaning in close. I visited Audrey before I left. I told her the truth. I told her she wasn't mine. I told her she was Richard's daughter, but that Richard was just a puppet for the man who sent her to prison. I told her that her grandpa Walter was the one who recorded the phone calls. I told her you were the anonymous source who tipped off the police about the brake lines when Marcus hesitated. Walter's eyes went wide. You told her? She's a Barrett, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Even if she's not my blood, I raised her. She knows how to hold a grudge. And she's already agreed to testify against you in exchange for a sentence reduction. She's going to tell the world every secret you ever told her during those Sunday walks in the park. Walter slumped back against the cushions. He looked every bit of his 80 years now. The shark had run out of water. I walked off the boat without another word. As I reached the dock, the IRS agents moved in. They didn't use sirens. They didn't use force. They just walked on board and began the systematic dismantling of Walter's legacy. 1 year later, I was sitting in a small cafe in the Pearl District. The rain was falling outside, but for the first time in my life, I didn't mind it. I had a new firm, a small, boutique office that specialized in forensic recovery. I helped people who had been blinded by their own trust. My life was quiet. I had sold the big house and the expensive cars. I lived in a loft with a view of the river. I didn't talk to Betty. I didn't talk to Richard. I had visited Audrey once more, just before she was transferred to a minimum security facility. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about forgiveness. We just sat in the silence of the visitation room. I'm sorry, Joseph, she'd said, her voice small. I know, I replied. I didn't tell her I loved her. I didn't tell her I'd be waiting for her. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. But as I walked away that day, I realized that I didn't hate her anymore. I just felt a profound, echoing sadness for the girl she could have been if she hadn't been born into a den of vipers. Megan and I remained friends. She had started a new life in Vancouver, and every now and then, we'd meet for dinner and talk about nothing in particular. She was the only one who truly understood the cost of the truth. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at the newspaper on the table. There was a small article on page 6 about the death of Walter Miller in a federal medical wing. It was 3 sentences long. No funeral was mentioned. No family was listed. I folded the paper and set it aside. The hero was gone. The idiot was gone. All that was left was a man who knew the value of $1 and the absolute, crushing weight of a secret. I stood up, adjusted my coat, and walked out into the rain. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where I was going, and for the first time in 25 years, I was the one holding the keys. Revenge, I realized, isn't a dish best served cold. It's a ledger that finally balances. And as the streetlights flickered on, painting the wet pavement in gold, I knew that my accounts were finally perfectly clear. The tragedy wasn't that I lost my family. The tragedy was that I almost lost myself trying to keep a lie alive. But the truth is a hard, cold thing. It doesn't give you a hug. It doesn't tell you it's going to be okay. It just gives you the ground to stand on. And for me, that was enough.